Professor Day, also Dr. Conegan will speak about vitrification.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here in Rome. This is just my second time in Rome. I was here for the ESHRE meeting 2 years ago. I had a very nice time, and I'm very happy to be back again. I'd like to thank Technogenetics and Irvine Scientific and the local people here at the American Hospital for the opportunity to be here to talk to you today. I've noticed you're all pretty quiet as an audience. Nobody's been causing any trouble or asking any questions or anything like that. Are there any embryologists here in the audience? No embryologists? You guys don't talk. All right. As part of my talk, I had some questions for embryologists, but I'm probably going to have to skip over that since we don't have any in the audience. My talk, I'm the last speaker of the day, I believe, and we're way ahead of schedule, so I have plenty of time. Right? I'd stay up here for 2 hours. I do need my long presentation. So, I want to talk today about vitrification. It's a process we use for freezing embryos and also nowadays for preserving oocytes very successfully. I'm not going to talk about oocyte vitrification, I'm only going to talk about embryo vitrification. We've been using this process to preserve embryos for over 5 years now. We started way back in 2007, and I'm going to tell you about our experience over these 5 years and what we've learned as we've gone down this path and how we've improved the process along the way. So I work in San Francisco in a private IVF clinic called Pacific Fertility Center, and there we go. I want to give you a little sort of introduction to our facility. This is our lab here in the background. Nice new lab that we put together a couple of years ago. We have what we would consider in the United States to be a relatively large IVF program. We do about 1,000 IVF cycles a year. And by the standards of some countries in Europe, that's small, but by United States standards, that's pretty big. We do a lot of our embryo transfers at the blastocyst stage, which means we keep the embryos in culture for a long period of time, almost as long as we can keep them in culture, before we decide which embryos we're going to transfer back to the patient. That's a little different than what a lot of people do in Europe. In Europe, there's a tendency in many countries and in many clinics to transfer embryos much earlier. In the United States, we like to hold on to the embryos and try and get more information and transfer them much later. So we do transfers at what we call the blastocyst stage in somewhere in the region of 60 to 70% of our patients. It's only patients who have very small numbers of eggs and therefore very small numbers of embryos that we actually do the transfers earlier on the second or third day of development. So typically if a patient has only 1 or 2 embryos to transfer, we will do the transfer early, but if they have lots of embryos, we will keep the embryos in the lab for a longer period of time and watch the embryos develop so that we can then make good choices on which embryos to transfer. So we end up doing, somewhere in the region of 900, 950 egg retrievals every year, and about half of patients in our program end up with some embryos to put in the freezer. Obviously, the older patients, just like Brian was talking about, often end up just making enough embryos to do a fresh transfer and don't get embryos frozen. But a lot of patients do end up with some embryos to freeze, and the average number of embryos that we freeze is just over 4. As a consequence of that, we do a lot of frozen embryo transfers, and the frozen embryo transfers make up about 25% of our load. So, if you came and visited our lab on any given day, you would probably find us doing 1 or 2 frozen embryo transfers on that day. All right, does everybody know who this is right here? This is Octomom, right? Octomom made us all famous in California and in the United States because she was an IVF patient in Southern California, and she delivered 8 babies.
How many?
8.
Oh, wow.
Hence the name Octomom. Right?
Okay.
And she had actually had 6 embryos transferred into her uterus by somebody who was a little reckless and not very considerate of what the potential consequences of their actions could be. Now, this obviously is an extreme, and it's something that we want to avoid. And
After the transfer.
Six embryos. Six? No, six, yes, six. So, this is an extreme example. And really what we want to do is, for IVF patients, we really want to transfer one embryo. That's the ideal situation, transferring just one embryo. The problem with transferring one embryo is that you limit the patient's chances of getting pregnant. With one embryo, there's a certain chance to get pregnant, and if you increase the number of embryos that you transfer to the patient, then you, just by simple math, you increase the chance that that patient might get pregnant. And many IVF programs will transfer multiple embryos in order to show that they have very high pregnancy rates and that they get a lot of their patients pregnant. Now, we need to move away from that, and we need to start transferring fewer embryos. And the Europeans really led this field, especially in Scandinavian countries. They really sort of have pushed ahead with transferring very low numbers of embryos, and in a lot of cases transferring just one embryo. And in the United States, we do not have a reputation for transferring just one embryo. We have the opposite reputation of being reckless and transferring lots of embryos. And when I think about this, in my mind, if you want to get your IVF program to be transferring fewer embryos to your patient, I think it has to happen in the lab. This process will evolve from what we do in the lab. I think it's the responsibility of the embryologist in the lab to get your IVF program to a level of proficiency or a level of success where you're confident in transferring one embryo. Think about the things that the embryologists do. We culture the embryos. We grow the embryos just like Dr. Tucker told us about in the first talk. If we don't grow good embryos, then the physicians and the patients are going to want to transfer more to have a better chance of getting pregnant. If we grow really nice embryos, and we can make our embryos really beautiful and really healthy and viable, then our patients and our physicians are going to be forced to transfer fewer because they're going to get lots of multiple pregnancies. We also choose which embryos get transferred and which embryos go in the freezer. If we make bad choices, pregnancy rates are going to be lower, and people are going to want to transfer more embryos. If we make good choices, again, that's going to drive people towards transferring just one embryo. And then finally, and this is the most important thing that we do in the lab, we have to be good at freezing embryos. We have to be really good at freezing embryos. Because if you convince a patient to transfer just one embryo, remember, in the United States, many patients have to pay quite a bit of money to do their IVF cycle. And if you tell them we want you to transfer just one embryo, then they're accepting a lower chance of pregnancy than if they transfer 2 or 3 embryos, but they're also getting a good chance of having a healthy singleton pregnancy. You have to be able to tell that patient that we're going to transfer one embryo. If that embryo doesn't implant, your frozen embryos will be here for you. We have insurance right here. If we transfer one embryo and that embryo doesn't work, the frozen embryos will be here for you, and your chance of getting pregnant from the frozen embryos is as good or better than with this fresh embryo right here. So if embryologists can freeze embryos very efficiently, now there's no reason to transfer more than one embryo in the fresh cycle. No reason, because the frozen embryos are safe, they work just as well, no reason to transfer more than one. So I think, getting the lab to doing more single embryo transfers, the responsibility is with the embryologist. Now, I told you that we like to do blastocyst stage transfers in the United States. That's our trend. And one of the reasons that we like to do that is because we say we can make better choices on which embryo to transfer. If we have a patient with 5 or 7 embryos, and we grow all of those embryos for 5 days in the lab, the embryos really start to sort themselves out, and you can see which is the most advanced embryo and which embryo is more slow, and you can transfer fewer embryos. So the idea is, instead of doing early transfer, do a later stage transfer and transfer fewer embryos. Now, if you look at the data, these are all patients who had embryos transferred on day 3, and this is government data. We report all of our data to the Centers for Disease Control, and you can see when we do day 3 embryo transfers, about 1/3 of patients transfer 2 embryos, about 1/3 of patients transfer 3 embryos, and about 20% of patients transfer 4 or more. We are transferring a lot of embryos in the United States. Less than 10% of patients transfer 1 embryo. And a lot of these patients are probably patients who only have 1 embryo. This is not elective single embryo transfer. These are probably patients who only have 1. Now, we say that if you let us take the embryos out to day 5, we will transfer fewer embryos. And to some extent, that's true. Like, the number of patients that are transferring 2 has gone down significantly, has gone up significantly. The number of patients that are transferring 3 has gone down. the number of patients that are transferring 4 has gone down, but we're still transferring 3 and 4 embryos in many of these cases. And the number of patients transferring 1 embryo really hasn't changed very much. It's essentially the same, about 10% here, a little over 13% here. We really haven't made a big difference by going on to day 5. So I don't think that this strategy is working very well. Now, how do we look at embryos in the lab? And again, as Dr. Tucker said, it's somewhat of a beauty contest. We look at embryos and we see how well do they look, how are they developing well, do they have the right structures, do they have the right number of cells as we would expect. And we have a grading system for embryos that's purely based on morphology. And in the blastocyst, the first thing we do is we ask, what stage is this blastocyst at? Is it an early blastocyst, just starting to come to the blastocyst stage with a small blastocele cavity? Is it a blastocyst with a larger cavity? Is it starting to expand, where we're seeing the zona pellucida starting to stretch? Or is it hatching out of the zona? And obviously, the more advanced the embryo, the better we think it is, because it's pushing ahead. The more retarded the embryo, the less well-developed the embryo is, then the less we like it, and the more likely we are to transfer more than 1 embryo. Now, the blastocyst has 2 structures. It has the inner cell mass, which is the precursor of the fetus and some of the extraembryonic membranes, and then it has the trophectoderm, which is the precursor of the placenta. And we score these 2 structures just on a very simple scale. We say, do we like the inner cell mass? Is it good? Is it average? Or is it not so good? And it's the same with the trophectoderm. So we use a pretty simple scoring system. Here's a blastocyst for us to score, right? So this blastocyst has inner cell mass right here, which is nice and compact, lots of cells, very well organized. And then the trophectoderm cells around the outside here, you can see there are lots of trophectoderm cells. If you look through the embryo, you can see the trophectoderm cells here in the back. It's got a big cavity in here, so the zona is really thin, so the embryo is very well expanded. So we call this an expanded blastocyst. The inner cell mass is good, and the trophectoderm is good. So when we have a sort of a textbook embryo like this, it's a pretty easy process to decide, how does this embryo look? Is it a good embryo or a bad embryo? The problem is not all embryos look that good. And one of the things that we do in the US is we ask embryologists to score embryos based on videos just to see what our proficiency is from one lab to the other. And this process is very subjective. So when we send out a video looking at a blastocyst right here, and we ask embryologists to go through the process of telling, what do you think of that embryo? How do you score it? We don't get good general agreement. So this is, that video was sent out to 119 labs, and most embryologists said that it was an early blastocyst, but about 10% of labs disagreed and called it some other stage other than early blastocyst. So, we have about 90% of the embryologists agree and about 10% disagree. When we look at the inner cell mass, which is these few cells in here, in my opinion, that inner cell mass doesn't look very good because there's not very many cells there and they're not very coherent, they're kind of disorganized. So I would have said that the inner cell mass was poor right here, but you can see a lot of embryologists thought it was okay. Same with the trophectoderm, not very many trophectoderm cells right here. It's a very early embryo. The trophectoderm is not very well organized or differentiated, but some embryologists thought that was okay. Some even thought it was good. Right? So again, not very good agreement right here, and a few outliers out here. Again, somewhere in the region of 5 to 10% of the labs polled thought that this embryo was fabulous. Right? And maybe in those labs, the way they culture embryos, this is the best embryo they ever see. Maybe they never get an embryo that's better than that, so they see this and they go, oh, that's a really nice embryo.